The Eve Timer. A short story by PJ Leonard. Part 2. Anthony reached under the bar, not daring to take his eyes off of the man. Sure enough, his fingers closed around something big and heavy, and he lifted up a baseball bat. The man, dressed like Santa, raised his gloved hands.
"Easy, Anthony," he said. "I mean no trouble. And I know how much damage you can do with a baseball bat. I remember getting one just like it for you many years ago."
The baseball bat slipped out of Anthony's hands, and it dropped onto his head, falling to the floor with a clatter. How do you know that?" said Anthony, rubbing his head. "And how do you know my name?" Santa stroked his beard.
"I remember the name of every child, even when they have children of their own. I don't need a list to check that."
Anthony slowly stepped out from behind the bar and walked up to this man. Every inch of him looked the part. The boots shone as though they were just polished, a golden buckle sparkling like tinsel on each. The buttons on the jacket were pressed with tiny pictures of reindeer. The white fluff around the cuffs and collars wasn't cheap cotton, but real rich fur flecked with hairs of grey. This was no suit from a shelf. Hand trembling, Anthony lifted a hand and carefully grasped a hold of the bottom of the long white beard. The man claiming to be Santa didn't move. Anthony tugged, and the beard stayed firmly in place. Anthony leapt back as though electrocuted. "Santa Claus?" he said again. Santa threw back his head and laughed, his belly rolling under his suit as he did.
"Ho, ho, ho! Yes, it is me, young Anthony. You could be sure of that. But listen carefully now. I need your help. I am only halfway through delivering all of the presents, and something has gone terribly wrong. Will you help me?"
Anthony rubbed his head. He hadn't had much to drink, had he? "How can I help Santa Claus?" he said. "I'm just some guy."
"I'll explain along the way," said Santa, heading towards the chimney. "Come now, we must be going. Time is of the essence. Besides, Dasher gets restless if I leave him out in the rain for too long."
Santa stood in the fireplace and reached out with a hand.
"Bring your tool bag too, Anthony. You'll be needing it."
He clutched the key to the room upstairs so tightly that it dug into Anthony's palm. Then he opened his hand, placed the key on the bar, picked up his tool bag, and took Santa's hand. The world whirled. The brick and the hearth spun into a blur of brown and red, and then cold blasted in his face. The spinning stopped, and he looked around. Roof tiles were under his shoes, rattling under the pitter-patter of rain. Other rooftops surrounded him, a sea of brick and concrete, and tiles of all shapes and sizes jutting out like waves, the occasional chimney standing high like a boat. He turned, and nearly slipped and tumbled from the roof. 8 reindeer stood in 2 lines of 4, tethered together by red and white rope that swirled like a candy cane. And there, at the back, was a big red sleigh, embroidered with trimmings of gold, a giant silky sack piled high in the back. Santa's sleigh. As Anthony walked slowly towards it, one of the reindeer swung a neck around to sniff at him. Anthony jolted and jumped aside.
"No, don't mind Vixen,"
Santa boomed, his head popping up from inside the sleigh.
"She's just curious. We don't get many visitors."
Anthony tried to think of a reply, but all thought was firmly lodged in his brain, refusing to come out as words. He just stood there, fully aware that his mouth opened and closed over and over like a dumbstruck goldfish. Santa's beard twitched as he grinned.
"Seems like you're in need of an explanation. Hop in. I'll explain on the way."
Anthony stepped into the sleigh. Santa picked up the reins, gave them a snap, and with a yell of "Yo!" the reindeer bolted forward. Anthony tumbled backwards and nearly fell into the sack of toys. He felt that familiar lurching in his stomach he felt every time he'd been in a plane as it took off, except rain splattered on his hands and face now. He shivered and squinted, but saw only billowing clouds. Then, quite suddenly, the rain and clouds disappeared. The sleigh had risen above the clouds, riding over it like a boat in the ocean. Above, the night sky was filled with twinkling stars and a thin slice of the moon. Strangely enough, Anthony no longer felt cold nor rushing wind as they flew through the night. How? Anthony scrambled for the right words. How can you? Santa laughed.
Oh, Anthony, I'm sure you've seen all of the movies and listened to all of the songs about me. True, some of it isn't quite right, but the main point is there. It's magic.
Magic? Anthony hung on the word. It had been a long, long time since he'd last believed in magic. Even now, flying next to Santa in his sleigh pulled by reindeer, he found it hard to believe. Santa turned to face him, his brow furrowed.
But that magic is failing, he said. You saw the clocks, right?
Yes, said Anthony. Santa shook his head.
They are telling the time correctly. It really is 1:15 a.m. Time itself has stopped. And it's all my fault.
Anthony raised an eyebrow. You stopped time? How?
Not on purpose, mind,
said Santa, pulling gently to the left rein and making the reindeer turn slightly to the left.
Let me explain. Have you ever noticed how Christmas Eve night seems so long?
Anthony shrugged. Honestly, not so much now, he said. But when I was a kid, sure. It felt like it went on forever. My daughter Lucy says the same thing. She can never get to sleep. She says she feels like she's slept 4 times already when it's still night time. Santa nodded.
Children are more sensitive to it. And they're right. Time really does slow down. There is an ancient machine in my workshop in the North Pole called the Eve Timer. Before I leave to do my deliveries each year, the Eve Timer is switched on and it makes time slow down. Slow enough for me to visit the billions of children in the world in one night.
And it's broken? Santa nodded again.
It's never happened before, and it's frozen time. If it's not fixed, Christmas Eve night will go on forever. And what is the point of delivering presents if Christmas Day never comes?
And you think I can fix it? Santa grinned.
I know you can, Anthony. And you have already fixed 2 clocks already. The Eve Timer is not much different from any other clock, except it's 1,000 years old, and it runs on magic.
That sounds completely different, said Anthony. Santa laughed.
Well, I'm sure you'll have some tool in that bag of yours that will help. All of my elves and I believe in you. Ah, here we are.
Anthony looked forward and felt his heart skip a beat. The clouds had cleared, revealing an endless field of ice below. As the sleigh descended towards the ground, something in the distance came to view, sticking out. As they flew closer, Anthony could make out stripes of red and white, topped by a sphere of gold.
The North Pole, said Santa. Home sweet home. I must say that it feels very strange to be coming back halfway through my deliveries.
But where's your workshop, Santa? He said. He couldn't help but feel a little silly saying it. Was this all just one huge dream? But Santa said nothing. Instead, the big man flew the sleigh in closer and closer to the North Pole until they were right on top of it.
Steady now,
he called to the reindeer as they lowered the sleigh towards the ground. Anthony felt a jolt as the North Pole hit the underneath of the sleigh, but instead of breaking through the wood, he felt a whirring sound and the sleigh lowered itself towards the ground. The North Pole, was it being pushed into the ground? The sleigh landed on the ice, and Anthony's stomach gave a lurch as he felt the ice crack underneath them. But Santa and the reindeer didn't seem bothered. Then, with a hiss of steam, a perfect circle of ice surrounding them broke away and lowered them into the ground. All went dark, and then Anthony winced as blinding lights flashed in his eyes. Blinking and rubbing his eyes, he looked around. The sleigh was descending through a vast chamber made of wood and stained glass windows that somehow glowed despite being underground. The hair on Anthony's arms bristled, standing on end as though there was electricity in the air. Pins and needles pricked on the tips of his fingers and toes.
"Welcome to my workshop," said Santa. "You may feel a little strange here. There is a strong magic in the air. It's very rare that I bring humans to this place."
Anthony looked around wildly, ignoring the growing ache in his neck. Ever since he'd been a child, he'd had an idea of what Santa's workshop would look like. But this was bigger than anything he could ever imagine. Toys were draped from the ceiling like streams of tinsel, glowing under the light of the windows, each window depicting items from the 12 days of Christmas. As the sleigh landed gently on the floor, he and Santa stepped out, and he looked down at the floor and saw, not a floor, but glass, revealing a vast cave stretching down below, filled with pastel-coloured lights, and pulleys lifting what looked like crates of crystals out of the darkness. And yet, as Anthony looked around, taking in the maze of corridors branching off from the chamber, he couldn't help but feel that the most important thing was missing. "Where are the elves?" he said, turning towards Santa. They're real, right?" Santa took off his hat.
"Oh, they're real, but they're not here right now. They never are on Christmas Eve night."
Anthony frowned, but before he could say anything, Santa turned away.
"Follow me, please, Anthony. The Eve timer is this way. Oh, and can you bring that tool bag of yours?"
Anthony turned, but the sleigh and reindeer had disappeared. Only his tool bag remained in the centre of the glass floor. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he picked up the bag and followed Santa down a corridor. Santa took a long, meandering route through the workshop, through what looked like dormitory rooms, rooms full of big workshop tables covered in wood shavings, a cosy room full of cushions, armchairs, and a roaring log fire, a library filled high with endless shelves of books, and strangely, a room that didn't seem like a room at all, but like a miniature outdoors with snow tumbling down to the iced ground. "How much further?" said Anthony, brushing the snow from his hair as they left the snow room and rounding a corner into another corridor. As if in answer, Santa turned at the next junction and into a huge room, the back wall of which was the biggest clock Anthony had ever seen. The clock face itself was as tall as a church tower, the hands like church spires. The numbers were Roman numerals plated with gold, and surrounding the clock was a casing of glass, showing the vast web of cogs, ratchets and springs behind the clock. And it was all utterly silent and still.
"The Eve timer," said Santa. "Just goes to show you that even magic breaks sometimes."
I don't think I can fix this," said Anthony, tearing his eyes away from the Eve timer to Santa. "I mean, look at it! Even if the problem isn't magic, I don't know that much about fixing clocks. Why me? Surely there must have been somebody better suited to this job than me. What about one of your elves?" Santa smiled.
"I believe in you, Anthony, just like you used to believe in me. And all the elves aren't here, as I mentioned."
"Where have they gone?"
"The same place everybody goes after they finish work for the year. The party,"
said Santa, though his smile had disappeared as he said it.
"I never get to go to that party. That's the night I work. Just goes to show that there's all kinds of people around the world who miss their family at Christmas. Even Santa Claus."
Santa put his hat back on, along with his smile.
Would you like a hot drink, Anthony? You look chilled to the bone.
Anthony nodded, and as Santa left the room, Anthony turned back to face the huge Eve timer. In the corner was a glass door leading into the mechanics. That looked as great a place to start as any. He walked up to the door, pulled it open by the bauble-shaped doorknob, and stepped inside. The silver and gold mechanics shone all around him. They were all so clean and polished that if Santa had told him that it had all been built yesterday, he would have believed him. He walked through the maze of metal slowly and quietly, as though he were in a church. The lights high above reflected off every surface, so much so that it was impossible to tell what was real and what was just a reflection. Anthony laid down his tool bag and scratched his head. Where to begin? As he turned, he caught sight of something very big near the back. A golden disc, bigger than a parachute. The pendulum. Well, that was where the problem had been in the last 2 clocks he'd fixed. Maybe it was the same problem here. As Anthony weaved through a field of springs to get to it, he wondered idly how he was going to get a pendulum bigger than his house moving. The weights on either side looked as though they could crush him if they fell. He laid a hand on the pendulum. It was cold to the touch, and when he pulled his hand away, a handprint of condensation remained there. He gave it a push. It didn't move. He frowned. Even this massive pendulum should have been able to move easily with just a push. He put his whole weight into it, pushing with his shoulder, but the pendulum did not budge. Wiping the beads of sweat from his brow, he looked up. Something was definitely jamming this pendulum, keeping it from moving. Maybe that was the problem?
Hot cocoa,
a voice boomed behind him.
My own recipe.
Anthony nearly leapt to the top of the pendulum in shock and spun around. Santa stood there, holding 2 big mugs of steaming hot cocoa. He held one out, and Anthony took it. He didn't realize just how cold he'd been until he took a sip, and the drink warmed him through right to the end of his nose.
So, any luck?
Said Santa, looking around. I might have an idea, said Anthony, handing the half-finished cocoa back to Santa. I need to check. He clambered up the pendulum and shimmied up the pole. He didn't dare look down, but as he drew closer to the top, he saw something stuck in the pivot. What was that? As he pulled himself higher and higher until he was almost as high as the roof, he saw it. A box. And not just any box. A Christmas present, he whispered, reaching up to grab it. It was wrapped in shiny red paper, but the sides were a little bit squashed from where the present had been wedged into the pivot. Was this what was blocking the Eve timer? Only one way to find out. He reached up and pulled at the present, but it was firmly stuck. Santa, can you pass up something? He yelled.
What do you need?
Anything will do. A spanner, a wrench, or... Without looking, something landed neatly into his hand. It was a candy cane. He shrugged, hooked it around the box, and pulled. The box tilted, and the pendulum groaned. Holding onto the pole tighter, Anthony gave one last great tug, and the present came loose. Catch it! He called as the present tumbled toward the ground. The pendulum swung gently to one side, and all around him Anthony heard the creaking of metal whirring slowly back into life.
It's working, said Santa. Quickly, Anthony, come down from here before the weights knock you off.
Anthony looked up just as the pendulum swung towards one of the weights. He gasped and slid down the pole before he hit it, racing back towards the ground. He slid off the top of the pendulum and nearly tripped over his tool bag as he landed, but Santa held out an arm and held him steady. Santa's eyes sparkled like fairy lights.
Oh, Anthony, you brilliant man,
he said, waving a hand at the cogs that were now turning and the springs that were now stretching.
You fixed the Eve timer. Time is flowing again, thanks to you.
All in a day's work, said Anthony, smiling. He looked at the present in Santa's hand. Whose present is that? Santa looked carefully from the present to Anthony, as though wondering what to say. Then he nodded to the door.
"Let's get out of this clock first," he said. "It's going to get a bit noisy in here."
Santa didn't say a word until he had led him all the way back to the main chamber. The sleigh and the reindeer were back, the huge sack of toys stacked in the back, ready to go. For a moment, Anthony thought that Santa was just going to toss the present in with the others and then they would leave without another word. But before he stepped into the sleigh, he turned to face Anthony. He held the present before him.
"I think you know who this present is for already, Mr. Parsons," said Santa.
Anthony frowned, looking at the present. Then his eyes rounded. "Lucy?" he said. That's my girl's present." Santa smiled.
"Among other presents, of course. She's been a very good girl this year."
Anthony looked down at his feet. "She has. She deserves a good Christmas. I should be home with her." Silence. Santa placed a gloved hand on his shoulder and he looked up.
"Well, her present is in my hands right now, so let's make the parson home my next delivery, shall we?"
Anthony blinked. "Meaning?" Santa laughed.
"Ho, ho, ho! Of course! Come, Anthony, it's Christmas Eve and your family are waiting."
Anthony jumped into the sleigh, heart racing. He felt so happy, so light, that he felt as though he were flying before the sleigh had lifted itself back through the ceiling and out into the icy North Pole. Soon they were racing beneath the stars once more, although now and then Santa lowered the sleigh as they passed towns, just as church bells tolled 1:30 a.m. Santa nodded and smiled.
"Looks like time is flowing again, nice and slowly, just as it should do on Christmas Eve."
"So why don't adults feel like Christmas Eve night is going slowly for them?" Anthony asked. "I mean, if time really is going slowly, then wouldn't everyone feel it?" Santa stroked his beard.
"It's a curious thing, one I've never really understood myself. Maybe it's because a lot of adults simply don't believe in me, or because most of the gifts I deliver are for children. I'm not sure. There is magic in this world that not even Santa Claus understands."
The sleigh swooped down towards a familiar-looking town, and instantly Anthony recognized the local supermarket, the main road into the town centre, and finally his own street. The reindeer slowed and pulled up on his roof. Santa cleared his throat and tapped on the bag of toys twice. 2 presents spilled from the top of the bag and rolled down to land perfectly in Santa's lap. He gathered them up with the other red present.
"Down we go,"
he said, clambering out of the sleigh and walking across the roof. Anthony stepped out too and peered over the edge to the street below. It was his street all right, and this was his house. It was strange to see it from this angle. Santa stood nearby, waiting patiently. Anthony grabbed his tool bag and walked over. "We don't have a chimney, and I've always wondered how this bit really works," Anthony said, well aware of how much he was smiling. "So, Santa, how do we get down from—" He blinked, and in that instant, the rooftop had changed to his living room. He stopped himself just before he walked into the mantelpiece and broke the photo frames there. Anthony looked around. Home. And the clock on the wall read 1:40 a.m. He was home in time for Christmas. He could see Lucy and be with his wife after all. "Thank you, Santa," said Anthony. "Thank you for—" Anthony looked around, but Santa wasn't there. Instead, the 3 presents sat under the Christmas tree, topped with a note on green paper. Anthony picked up the note and read, "Dear Lucy, your 4 gifts, just as you asked. Merry Christmas, Santa Claus." Anthony frowned. 4 gifts? But there were only 3 presents under the tree. Had Santa forgotten to deliver the 4th? Anthony felt a warm wave of understanding wash over him. Of course, Santa had delivered 4 things. He rushed to the window just in time to see a shadow rush away through the night sky. He smiled, turned, and headed for bed. Christmas Eve night felt like the longest it had ever felt for Anthony that night. The end.